My name is Madeline Hale, but everyone called me Maddie. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a family where the word legacy was used more often than the word love. My father, Richard Hale, built Hale Development and Construction from a small contracting office into one of the most respected commercial construction companies in the region. He loved that company with a kind of devotion most people reserve for their children. In his mind, Hale Development was not just a business. It was proof. Proof that he had worked harder than other men. Proof that the Hale name meant something. Proof that the family deserved its place in every boardroom, charity gala, and private dining room in Charlotte. And from the time we were kids, my oldest brother Grant was treated like the future owner of that proof. Grant was handsome, confident, and good at saying exactly what my father wanted to hear. He wore dress shirts before he needed to. He followed Dad around job sites with a little notebook when he was 12. By high school, Dad was already introducing him as the next generation. My second brother, Lucas, was different. Quieter, sharper. He became the legal mind of the family before he ever passed the bar. If Grant was supposed to inherit the company, Lucas was supposed to protect it. Then there was me, the daughter, the youngest, the one who took things apart to see how they worked, the one who preferred science fairs to country club brunches, the one who could calculate load distribution before I could comfortably make small talk with my mother's friends. My mother, Cynthia, never yelled. That was not her style. She corrected people with smiles, softened insults with perfume and pearls, and turned family tension into polite stories other people could understand. When relatives asked about Grant, she said, "He's learning the business." When they asked about Lucas, she said, "He has such a legal mind." When they asked about me, she paused. "Maddie is very bright," she would say, "a little independent, still finding where she fits." I heard that phrase so many times it started to feel like my full name. Still finding where she fits. The problem was, my father had already decided where I fit. In 2012, when I was 18, I received a nearly full scholarship to Georgia Tech for materials engineering and structural science. I still remember holding the letter in both hands at the kitchen island. I had read it 3 times before I showed anyone. I thought my father would be proud. He took the letter, read the first page, and set it down like it was a subcontractor's bid he had already decided to reject. "Georgia Tech," he said, "for materials." "Materials engineering," I corrected quietly. "And structural science." He leaned back in his chair. "Maddie, that's research, lab work. It isn't the real side of construction." "It affects the real side," I said. "It's about how structures perform over time." Grant was standing near the fridge, drinking water straight from a glass bottle. He smirked but said nothing. Dad tapped the letter with 2 fingers. "I already spoke to people at Wakefield. Their construction management program would make more sense. You could come back here after graduation and start in procurement. Learn under Grant." Under Grant. Not with Grant. Under him. I looked at the scholarship letter again. Tuition covered, housing covered, research stipend included. It was not just admission. It was freedom with an official seal. "I want to go to Georgia Tech," I said. The room went still. My mother glanced at my father before she looked at me. That was how our house worked. Even concern waited for his permission. Dad's voice stayed calm, which somehow made it worse. "So I offer to pay for a real path, and you choose a scholarship because strangers praised your science project." "It's not a science project." "It is if it does not build anything." That sentence stayed with me. I did not argue much after that. At 18, I still believed facts could speak for themselves. I believed if I worked hard enough, built something meaningful enough, became undeniable enough, my family would eventually understand. My mother walked me to the front hall later that night. She touched my shoulder gently, like she was comforting me and correcting me at the same time. "Your father just wants you to be practical," she said. "Don't make this into rejection." But I was not the one making it into rejection. I had chosen a school. He had heard disobedience. By the time I left for Atlanta, the story had already changed. I was no longer the daughter who earned a scholarship. I was the daughter who refused guidance, the daughter who chose theory over business, the daughter who did not understand the Hale legacy. Grant got a new watch that summer for completing an internship at Hale Development. Lucas got help with his law school deposits. I got luggage. Nice luggage, to be fair. My mother chose it herself. Pale gray, elegant, appropriate for a girl leaving home. At the door, my father hugged me with one arm. "Call when you come to your senses," he said. I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. I drove away from Charlotte with my scholarship letter in a folder beside me and a strange ache in my chest. I was hurt, but I was still hopeful. I told myself families needed time. I told myself my father respected results. I told myself that one day I would bring him something real, something measured and proven, and he would finally see that I had not chosen wrong. I did not know then that my family had already written my role without me. And once a family decides who you are, they can spend years ignoring every piece of evidence that proves them wrong. At Georgia Tech, I learned that buildings were not as silent as people thought. Steel moved, concrete shifted, roof systems carried stress differently in heat than they did in cold. A warehouse could look perfectly normal from the ground while tiny changes were happening above everyone's heads. That fascinated me. Not because I was afraid of buildings, because I respected them. My father loved finished structures, ribbon cuttings, big glass entrances, a company name on a temporary fence. He loved the part people could see. I became obsessed with the part people missed. During my second year, a professor named Dr. Samuel Ortiz let me join one of his research groups. He had spent decades studying structural fatigue and composite materials. He was patient, blunt, and not easily impressed. The first time I showed him my notes, he said, "You're asking better questions than you're answering." I said, "Is that bad?" "No," he said. "That's where useful work starts." The project involved fiber optic sensors, thin enough to attach along beams and support points without interfering with the structure. They could read small changes in strain, temperature, and load behavior over time. Most people thought of inspections as something done on a schedule. Once a year, twice a year, after a storm, after a complaint. But buildings did not wait for inspection dates. That became painfully clear after a partial warehouse collapse in Alabama. It was not a famous disaster. It did not stay in national headlines. But in our department, everyone read the reports. The official finding pointed to fatigue that had developed quietly. Warning signs existed, but not in a form anyone had gathered continuously. I remember sitting in the lab after midnight, reading the report until the pages blurred. I kept thinking, what if the building had been able to speak sooner? That question became the center of my life. Dr. Ortiz helped me refine the engineering side. Ethan Cole, a computer science student I met through a campus research showcase, helped build the software layer. Ethan was the kind of person who could stare at messy data and see structure inside it. I understood the physical behavior. He understood how to turn signals into alerts someone could actually use. By senior year, we had a working prototype. It was ugly, wires everywhere. A dashboard that looked like it had been designed by 3 exhausted students in a coffee machine. But it worked. It could detect small changes in structural strain and flag patterns that deserved attention before they became obvious damage. I thought that would be enough to make my father listen. After graduation in 2016, I came home to Charlotte for 2 weeks. My father invited me to lunch at his office. Hale Development occupied 2 floors in a clean brick building with framed project photos lining the hallway. Grant's picture was already on the wall from some leadership retreat. Lucas had a plaque from a legal association near my father's conference room. There was no sign I had ever existed there. Dad slid a folder across the table. "I can start you in procurement," he said. "You'll learn vendors, pricing, schedules. It's practical." I opened the folder. The job description was entry-level. Not insulting on paper, but insulting in context. He was not offering me a chance to use what I had studied. He was offering me a place where my education could be ignored politely. "I'm not coming back to work under Grant," I said. His jaw tightened. "This is not about Grant." "It is a little about Grant. It's about you learning how real companies operate." I took a breath. "I'm starting one." He stared at me for a moment. Then he gave a short laugh, like I had said something charming and childish. "A company doing what?" Structural monitoring. Continuous risk detection for industrial buildings. So, he said, warning devices on walls. The words landed flat. I tried to explain the sensors, the data, the gap in the inspection model, the insurance applications, the way a small alert could prevent a shutdown, a lawsuit, maybe even a collapse. He listened the way powerful people listen when they are only waiting for you to finish. Then he closed my folder. Maddie, that is not a business. That is a research project looking for a buyer. A week later, I moved to Durham. Ethan came with me. Dr. Ortiz agreed to advise us part-time. We incorporated North Star structural systems with more confidence than money. Our first office was a rented industrial bay with bad lighting and a door that stuck when it rained. I sent my father a short investment memo anyway. Not because I needed him to save me. I wanted him to read it like a businessman. I wanted, just once, to be evaluated by the quality of the work instead of the shape of the path. 3 days later, his email came back. He said he was proud that I was trying something. He said he did not invest family capital into experimental devices. He said Grant understood the construction market better than I did. And near the bottom, he wrote one sentence I never forgot. I don't see warning devices on walls as a real business. I read it twice. Then I saved it in a folder labeled North Star, Founding Documents. At the time, I did not save it as evidence. I was not planning revenge. I was 22 years old, tired, scared, and trying to convince building owners to trust technology they had never heard of. But something in me knew not to delete it. After that, I stopped explaining as much. When my mother asked what I was doing in Durham, I said, structural safety work. By Thanksgiving, she was telling people I checked warehouses. Grant liked that version. At dinner, he raised his glass and said, "To Maddie, keeping walls from getting nervous." Everyone laughed. I smiled because it was easier than giving another lecture no one wanted. But in Durham, the prototype kept improving. The alerts got cleaner. The dashboard got sharper. The sensors started telling stories the eye could not see. My family thought I had chosen a small life. I knew I was building a way for silent structures to leave a record. The first 2 years of North Star were not glamorous. Ethan and I worked out of the industrial bay in Durham because it was the only place we could afford that had enough room for equipment. The office section had 2 desks, 3 mismatched chairs, and an air conditioner that made more noise than cold air. I lived carefully. I bought groceries with a calculator open on my phone. I delayed replacing anything that could still function with tape or patience. Most weeks, I drove hundreds of miles between warehouses, cold storage facilities, and manufacturing plants, carrying demonstration equipment in the back of my car. The technology was improving. Selling it was harder. Plant managers understood broken equipment. They understood visible cracks, leaking roofs, and inspection reports. What they did not understand was why they should pay a small company from Durham to tell them that something might be changing inside a structure that looked perfectly fine. One manager in South Carolina listened to my entire presentation, crossed his arms, and said, "So your machine tells me my building is thinking about breaking?" Not exactly. That's what I heard. I learned to explain less and demonstrate more. Instead of talking about fiber optics for 20 minutes, I showed changes in strain data under controlled loads. Instead of promising prevention, I explained probability, baselines, and deviations. I stopped trying to sound impressive. People trusted what they could verify. That principle became part of North Star before we had enough employees to call ourselves a real department. By early 2018, we had several small pilot installations. One was at a distribution center in Tennessee. The building was large, busy, and ordinary. Trucks moved through it around the clock. The roof system had passed its scheduled inspections. Nothing about the facility suggested an emergency. Then our system began recording a pattern. It was subtle at first. A small shift appeared during one loading cycle, then returned close to baseline. 2 days later, the same area showed a similar movement. The numbers were not dramatic enough to justify shutting down a building, but the repetition bothered me. Ethan called me over to his screen. "You seeing this?" "I am." "Sensor error?" "Maybe." That was the answer I wanted to eliminate first. We checked calibration history, normal. We compared nearby sensors, stable. We reviewed temperature variation, not enough to explain the pattern. Then the signal appeared again. The change was small, but it was consistent. Something near one section of the roof system was responding differently under load than it had during the original baseline period. I called Dr. Ortiz. He reviewed the data remotely and asked me the question he always asked when I became too attached to a theory. What would prove you wrong? A clean physical inspection. Then ask for one. We did not call the building owner and announce that the roof was failing. We did not send an alarming message to the insurance carrier. We prepared a technical notice explaining that the monitoring system had identified a repeatable deviation and recommended an independent inspection of a defined section. That distinction mattered to me. Data could tell us where to look. It could not be allowed to become theater. The insurer approved the inspection. An independent structural engineering firm sent a team to the facility. I was not part of that inspection. For 2 days, we waited. On the third morning, I was standing beside Ethan in our office when an email arrived from the engineering firm. The first message was short. They had identified cracking consistent with metal fatigue in a series of steel roof connections. Additional evaluation was underway. I read the sentence 3 times. Ethan leaned towards the screen. That's it? That's it. The affected area was partially evacuated. Operations were redirected, while engineers completed a wider assessment. The damaged connections were reinforced and replaced before the problem developed into a larger structural failure. No one was injured. There was no dramatic collapse, no camera crews, no breaking news banner. And that was exactly what success looked like. A dangerous condition had been found early enough that the most important event was the one that never happened. Because the facility owner, insurer, and engineering firms were bound by confidentiality agreements, North Star could not use the case publicly. We could not put the company's name in a press release or turn the incident into a marketing campaign. For a young company desperate for credibility, that was frustrating. But something more valuable happened quietly. The insurance carrier commissioned a formal technical review. Their engineers compared our sensor timestamps with maintenance records, environmental conditions, loading cycles, and the independent inspection findings. They examined whether the alert had appeared before the physical damage was identified through conventional inspection. Weeks later, we received the final report. The conclusion was careful, technical, and far more powerful than any advertisement. North Star's monitoring system had identified a repeatable structural deviation before the fatigue cracking was discovered through targeted physical inspection. I sat alone with the report for several minutes. For years, my work had been described by people who did not understand it. A school experiment, a research project, warehouse checking. This was different. Independent engineers had tested the sequence. The sensor detected a deviation. The data was reviewed. An outside inspection was ordered. Physical damage was confirmed. For the first time, the value of North Star existed in a record that did not depend on my confidence or anyone's opinion of me. The report circulated privately inside the industrial insurance world. A few months later, an investment group connected to a large industrial insurer asked to meet with us. Their team spent weeks reviewing our software, hardware reliability, pilot results, and technical documentation. They did not care what kind of car I drove. They did not care that our office furniture looked like it came from 3 different garage sales. They cared about the data. At the end of the process, they invested $1.8 million in North Star. The money changed what we could build. We hired additional engineers. We improved the hardware casing. Ethan expanded the analytics platform. We started developing a cleaner installation process that could scale beyond individual pilot sites. Nothing about my personal life changed immediately. I stayed in the same townhouse. I kept driving the same car. That summer, my mother called after a family gathering I had missed because of work. "Aunt Diane asked about you," she said. "What did you tell her?" "That you're still trying to make something out of that research project." I looked through the glass wall of our small conference room. On the other side, 2 new engineers were reviewing installation plans for our next group of sites. "Okay," I said. There was a pause. That's all? What else should I say? My mother changed the subject. After the call, I returned to work. I did not correct her. I did not tell her about the report or the investment. The Tennessee case was confidential, and the funding was not something I needed to announce at a family dinner. More importantly, I was beginning to understand something. Truth and reputation did not always move at the same speed. My family could keep believing I was trying to turn a research project into a career. Meanwhile, North Star had its first independent proof, its first serious capital, and a method that had worked exactly the way we designed it to work. Alert. Verification. Independent confirmation. A record. For the first time since leaving Charlotte, I no longer needed to imagine that my work might matter someday. I knew it did. Between 2019 and 2021, North Star stopped feeling fragile. Not safe. I never thought of a growing company as safe. But we were no longer living contract to contract, wondering whether one delayed payment would force us to postpone payroll. Our systems were installed in cold storage facilities, manufacturing plants, and distribution centers across several states. Some clients came through insurance relationships. Others came through referrals from facility managers who had seen what continuous monitoring could do. By the end of 2021, annual revenue had reached $14 million. I still owned 46% of the company. Those numbers were not something I discussed at family dinners. They belonged in financial statements, board meetings, and tax filings. At home, numbers had always been used differently. They were announcements, proof of rank. I preferred records. When North Star outgrew its rented space, I created MHC Industrial Holdings and used it to purchase an old manufacturing property outside Durham. The building needed work, but the structure was solid. It had enough floor space for testing, hardware assembly, engineering offices, and future expansion. I spent weeks reviewing inspection reports, financing terms, renovation estimates, and environmental records before signing anything. The day we closed, Ethan stood in the middle of the empty production floor and looked around. "You know this place is ugly, right?" "Very." "And you still bought it." "I bought the roof, the loading access, the square footage, and the zoning." He laughed. "That might be the least romantic sentence anyone has ever said about real estate. I liked the building because it made sense. That was enough." My personal life remained almost unchanged. I stayed in the same townhouse because I liked the neighborhood and spent most of my time working anyway. I kept the Subaru because it started every morning. My family noticed those things. They noticed nothing else. At Christmas, my mother looked through the front window when I arrived and said, "You're still driving that car? It works. You should at least think about appearances, Maddie." I handed her the pie I had brought. "I'll put it on my list." She did not hear the joke. That same evening, Dad announced that he had loaned Grant $600,000 to help him purchase a house in one of Charlotte's most expensive neighborhoods. He said it casually, between dinner and dessert. "It's not a gift," he explained. "It's an investment in stability." Grant lifted his glass. "Family interest rate." Dad smiled. "Zero is still a number." Everyone laughed. I did too, lightly. A few months later, I learned Dad had invested $350,000 in a real estate fund Lucas had introduced to him. Lucas explained the structure over dinner, and Dad listened carefully. He asked questions about projected returns, downside protection, management fees, and asset concentration. I watched the conversation without interrupting. What stayed with me was not the amount. My father had every right to do whatever he wanted with his money. What stayed with me was his attention. He gave Lucas nearly 40 minutes of serious questions. He challenged assumptions. He asked to see documents. He wanted to understand the structure before committing capital. That was what I had wanted years earlier. Not a check, a serious reading. My mother called both decisions examples of Dad supporting the family's future. I understood then that the phrase did not include everyone equally. By that point, North Star had more than enough capital to operate. I did not need anything from Richard Hale financially. The strange part was that financial independence did not erase the old imbalance. It simply made it easier to see. I stopped arguing with it. At family gatherings, I listened more than I spoke. That was how I started noticing the way Grant talked about Hale development. He had always been confident, but his language changed as Dad gave him more authority. Every project became massive. Every potential client became a near certainty. Every meeting became a breakthrough. At a Sunday dinner in late 2021, Grant announced that Hale Development had nearly $1 billion in its pipeline. Dad looked delighted. "That's what scale looks like," he said. Lucas nodded. "The market is moving fast." I had spent enough time around contracts and insurance underwriting by then to know that the word pipeline could mean almost anything. So I asked one question: "How much of that is under signed contract?" Grant looked at me. "What?" "The billion. How much is contracted revenue, and how much is letters of intent or active bids?" The table went quiet for half a second. Then Grant smiled. "You've been reading business articles now?" "I'm asking a question. You monitor buildings, Maddie. Development finance is different." "I know it's different." "Then trust me." Dad leaned back with an amused expression. "Grant knows his numbers." I looked at my brother. He had not answered mine. That interested me more than the insult. I did not push. I had no role at Hale Development and no desire to create an argument over figures I could not verify. But I understood the difference between possible revenue and committed revenue. North Star had survived because Ethan and I never confused interest with contracts or projections with cash. Grant seemed comfortable doing exactly that. Over the following months, Dad gave him more authority over project selection, negotiations, and expansion strategy. Grant began representing Hale Development at larger industry events. His name appeared more often in company announcements. People started talking about succession as if it had already happened. My mother loved it. At one charity lunch, she introduced Grant as the future of Hale Development. Lucas was our family's legal mind. When she reached me, she smiled. "And Maddie has her little technology company in Durham." I looked at her. Little. North Star had just closed a year with $14 million in revenue. MHC Industrial Holdings owned the facility where more than 40 people now worked. Our monitoring systems were operating across multiple states. I could have corrected her. I could have listed the numbers. Instead, I said, "That's right." Her smile relaxed. That was the moment I understood something important about my family. Their version of me was useful to them. Grant needed to be the builder. Lucas needed to be the professional. I needed to be the one who had wandered away and never quite found the road back. If I corrected that story, they would have to ask harder questions. Questions about why no one had been curious. Questions about why success only counted when it looked like Dad's version of success. Questions about whether the son being prepared to inherit everything was actually building something stable. I was no longer interested in forcing those questions. My company had financial statements. My ownership was documented. The industrial property belonged to MHC Industrial Holdings, not to a family story. Contracts existed whether anyone in Charlotte understood them or not. I had learned to trust things that could be verified. Grant, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly skilled at selling possibility. Dad saw ambition and rewarded it with authority. I saw a man making promises faster than the underlying numbers could support them. At the time, I did not think Grant was doing anything illegal. I had no evidence of that, and I would never accuse someone based on instinct. But I knew what disciplined growth looked like, and I knew what pressure looked like too. North Star was growing because we had learned to question every assumption before putting money behind it. Hale Development was growing because my father had decided Grant was the future, and every new promise seemed to confirm a decision he had made years earlier. We were both moving forward. We were just building on very different foundations. By 2022, Grant was no longer simply working for my father. He was trying to become him. I could see it in this way he talked about growth. Richard had built Hale Development slowly, one commercial project at a time. Grant wanted to prove he could do in 5 years what Dad had done in 30. From a distance, people called that ambition. I saw pressure. Grant had been told since childhood that the company would someday be his. That sounded like privilege, and it was. But Richard's approval always came with conditions. Success earned warmth. hesitation earned contempt. Dad respected men who moved first. Grant had learned that lesson too well. Lucas once told me, during a rare quiet conversation, "Grant doesn't know how to tell Dad something isn't working." Does anyone? Lucas gave me a tired smile. Fair point. By then, Lucas was handling more of Hale Development's outside legal work. He reviewed major contracts, corporate structures, and disputes that Richard preferred to keep away from the board. Lucas was cautious by nature, but caution inside our family had limits. He could advise Grant privately. He could rewrite a contract. He could warn him that something created exposure. What Lucas almost never did was openly challenge him in front of Dad. That pattern mattered when Hale Development won Rivergate Commerce Park. The project was outside Richmond, Virginia. 8 large logistics buildings, multiple tenants, aggressive delivery targets, and enough prestige to move Hale Development beyond its regional reputation. Grant led the bid. At a family dinner after the award was announced, Dad opened a bottle of expensive bourbon and called Rivergate the project that changes the map. Grant looked happier than I had seen him in years. "We beat 2 national firms," he said. Lucas asked, "How aggressive was the schedule?" Grant's expression changed slightly. "Competitive." "That wasn't my question." Dad waved a hand. "They won, Lucas. Don't turn a victory into a deposition." Grant smiled again. I remembered that moment later, because Lucas had asked the right question. The schedule was extremely aggressive. So was the margin. Grant had lowered both to win the project, believing volume and future contracts would make up the difference. The plan depended on stable material costs, fast approvals, and almost no serious delay. Then steel prices moved against them. I did not know the internal numbers at the time. I learned them much later through the records. But the effect was immediate. Rivergate's projected profit narrowed until even a moderate delay threatened to erase it. Grant began pushing the project team harder. Not recklessly at first. He demanded faster vendor decisions, shorter review cycles, more coordination calls. He treated every lost day as money being taken directly from the company. Then a supplier proposed substitutions. The changes involved certain roof connections and insulation materials. On paper, the substitutions reduced costs and protected the schedule. But an independent engineer reviewing the project said the changes required additional evaluation before approval. Grant did not formally cancel the review. That distinction became important. He postponed it. His reasoning was simple. Hale Development was approaching a payment milestone. If the project reached it on schedule, cash would come in and pressure would ease. Then the additional review could happen without threatening the entire timeline. Temporary, Grant told himself. Just until the milestone. That was how the first dangerous choice entered Rivergate, not with someone announcing that safety did not matter, but with a man convincing himself that proper procedure could wait a few weeks. The project continued moving. Then the paperwork became a problem. One inspection record showed a review date that did not fit the actual sequence of work. A project manager under Grant's authority changed the date so the file appeared complete. I did not know the manager. I still don't know whether Grant directly ordered that specific alteration. What the later records established was simpler. The changed document entered the project file, and the work continued. Lucas saw enough to know something was wrong. A dispute had already developed with one of the subcontractors involved in the substitutions. Instead of bringing the irregularities to the full board, Lucas helped structure a confidentiality agreement around the dispute. His justification was that litigation would damage the project. Grant's justification was that the review would still happen. Richard's assumption was that his sons had everything under control. 3 different explanations, one growing problem. From Durham, I knew none of those details. North Star was expanding its relationships with industrial insurers, and one of those relationships involved Redwood Mutual. They were interested in continuous monitoring because traditional inspection cycles left long periods without fresh structural data. During a quarterly planning meeting, our team reviewed a list of facilities being considered for deployment under a broader insurance program. I did not study every property name. There were too many, spread across multiple states and portfolios. North Star had grown beyond the point where I personally touched every installation. At the time, that felt like progress. I had no reason to imagine that somewhere inside those insurance relationships, our technology was moving closer to Hale development. What I did notice was Grant. At family events, he seemed more energized and more exhausted at the same time. He checked his phone constantly. He talked about Rivergate as if finishing it would settle every question anyone had ever asked about him. One evening I asked him, "You sleeping?" He looked up from his phone. "I'm building." "That wasn't what I asked," he smiled without humor. "Some of us don't get paid to watch graphs." I let it go. The insult did not bother me anymore. The exhaustion did. But Grant had spent his entire life being rewarded for confidence. Concern sounded like criticism to him. Questions sounded like doubt. And doubt was the one thing he could never let Richard see. Rivergate kept moving. The additional review remained unfinished. The altered inspection records stayed in the file. Lucas knew enough to be uncomfortable but chose containment over disclosure. Grant believed he only needed time. Dad believed his heir was delivering the biggest project in company history. And in another part of the industry, without any of us understanding the significance yet, North Star's monitoring system was being placed into the same chain of insurance oversight surrounding Rivergate. My brother was building under pressure. I was building systems designed to record pressure. Neither of us knew how soon those two things would meet. By the time North Star's equipment went live at Rivergate, I was not involved in routine installations anymore. That was intentional. We had built teams for deployment, calibration, data review, and client communication. If every unusual reading still needed my personal attention, then I had failed to build a company. My job was to improve the system, not stand over every screen. Redwood Mutual had selected 2 Rivergate buildings for continuous monitoring under its industrial risk program. Building 4 was one of them. The first alert did not come to me. It appeared on a Monday morning in North Star's technical review queue. A sensor group near part of the roof system had recorded a deviation from baseline behavior under repeated loading conditions. The software did what it was designed to do. It compared the new readings with historical data, temperature changes, neighboring sensors, and known operating cycles. The pattern survived the first automated checks. A structural analyst reviewed it manually. Then a senior engineer reviewed the analyst's work. Neither declared an emergency. They issued a critical review report. The report identified the affected zone, explained the abnormal strain pattern, and recommended targeted inspection before additional assumptions were made about the cause. Under Redwood Mutual's protocol, the report was distributed electronically to designated project and risk contacts. Every transmission created a receipt. Every access required an authenticated account. Every document opening generated a timestamp. We had designed the system that way, because technical warnings were useless if people could later argue that nobody had received them. At 9:42 the next morning, an account assigned to Grant Hale opened the report. The server recorded it. At that moment, I knew none of this. To me, Rivergate was still one project among many. 11 days after the first report, a North Star analyst added a note to the file. The recommended inspection had not been scheduled. Redwood Mutual followed up with the designated project contacts. The response was vague. Site coordination was underway. Scheduling issues were being resolved. Inspection access would be confirmed shortly. Then an internal Hale development email was sent. I would see it later. Grant wrote to the project team that the additional inspection should be delayed until after the upcoming lender review. The message was short. No dramatic language, no confession, no admission that he believed the building was unsafe. Just an instruction to wait. That was what made it serious. The report had identified a repeatable anomaly and recommended targeted inspection. Grant had opened it. Then he had connected the timing of the inspection to a financial review. 17 days after the first warning, the system detected the pattern again. This time, the deviation was broader. The second alert was compared against the original event. The software found enough similarity to link them into the same case file. Our senior engineer increased the review status. Redwood Mutual sent another notice. Still, no inspection was scheduled. I was in a product meeting when Ethan mentioned the case for the first time. We have a repeat structural deviation in Virginia, he said. Industrial? Logistics? Environmental explanation? Engineering says unlikely. I nodded. Follow protocol. That was the entire conversation. I did not ask for the client name. There was no reason to. North Star had spent years building procedures so personal attention would not determine which risks mattered. Then the third warning came. It arrived during an overnight monitoring cycle. The pattern crossed the escalation threshold established under the Redwood Mutual Agreement. The system automatically changed the case classification and required independent inspection. That status also moved the file into executive review. The next morning, I opened the summary packet. I read the facility name first. Rivergate Commerce Park. Then the contractor. Hale Development and Construction. I stopped moving. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. I had known Rivergate was Grant's biggest project. I had heard the speeches about it. I had watched my father talk about it like a monument to the family name. But I had never connected it to the Redwood Mutual portfolio. Ethan was sitting across the conference table. You okay? I turned the laptop slightly toward him. He read the name. Oh. That was all he said. I opened the case history. First alert, critical review report, distribution record, access history. Second alert, follow-up notice. Third alert, mandatory escalation. I clicked into the access log. Grant's account had opened the first report. I checked the timestamp twice. Then I found the correspondence attached by Redwood Mutual's risk team. The internal instruction to delay inspection until after lender review was there. I leaned back. Until that moment, part of me had wanted a simpler explanation. Maybe the project team had missed the notice. Maybe the report had gone to the wrong person. Maybe scheduling had failed somewhere between the insurer and the site. The record did not support any of those explanations. Grant knew. And after knowing, he chose delay. Ethan asked, "Do you want me to move this to someone else?" I understood why he asked. This was my brother, my father's company, the business name I had grown up hearing at breakfast, dinner, holidays, and every important family event. I could call Grant. I could tell him I had seen the file. I could give him a chance to explain before the formal process moved further. For about 10 seconds, I wanted to. Then I looked at the timestamps again. The system had already given him that chance. Not as a sister, as a responsible project executive. He had received a technical warning. He had opened it. He had chosen what to do next. I closed the laptop. No private calls, I said. Ethan watched me carefully. You sure? No, but that doesn't change the procedure. I asked the compliance team to preserve the case exactly as it existed, and to confirm that no one at North Star altered distribution lists, notes, or access records. I also disclosed my family relationship to outside counsel. That was the first time I understood how dangerous the situation could become for everyone involved. The technical question was still unresolved. We did not yet know exactly what was causing the abnormal readings, but the evidence question had already changed. A warning existed, a receipt existed, knowledge existed, and a written decision to delay existed. For years, my family had been able to reshape stories through confidence, repetition, and status. Digital systems did not care who Richard Hale trusted. They recorded what happened. That morning, I did not feel victorious. I felt divided. Grant was still my brother. Hale Development was still the company my father had spent most of his life building. But Building 4 was not a family argument. People worked inside it. Insurance decisions depended on accurate disclosure. Lenders depended on honest records. Engineers needed the freedom to inspect problems before financial deadlines made those problems inconvenient. I had spent years building technology that could notice when a structure behaved differently from the story being told about it. Now that technology had noticed something inside my own family's business, I could not ask it to look away. So I made one decision. From that point forward, everything would stay on the record. The morning after Rivergate entered executive review, I met with North Star's general counsel. Her name was Karen Whitmore. She had joined us when the company became large enough that legal questions could no longer be handled through outside firms and emergency phone calls. I told her everything relevant. Grant was my brother, Richard was my father. I had no ownership interest in Hale development and no operational role there. But the relationship created an obvious conflict that had to be documented. Karen listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked, "Have you contacted either of them?" "No." "Have they contacted you?" "No." "Keep it that way." I nodded. Then I authorized a legal hold. The order covered every Rivergate record in North Star's possession: server logs, email delivery receipts, engineering notes, internal comments, calibration records, report versions, user access history. Nothing could be deleted under normal retention schedules. Nothing could be edited without leaving a trace. Nothing could quietly disappear because someone decided later that it looked inconvenient. Karen asked our outside counsel to supervise the preservation process. Compliance created restricted copies of the relevant records. Engineering staff were instructed not to discuss the case outside authorized channels. It was not dramatic work. That was the point. People imagine important evidence as a hidden folder discovered in a locked drawer. Most of the time, protecting truth is less cinematic. It means preserving boring records before anyone realizes how important they may become. Meanwhile, Redwood Mutual exercised its contractual right to require an independent physical inspection of Building 4. North Star did not choose the inspection firm. I did not speak to the engineers before they entered the property. The technical team gave them the defined sensor zone and the relevant data window. Nothing more. Then we waited. The preliminary findings arrived 4 days later. The engineers had identified multiple load-bearing connections that did not match the original approved specifications. Several showed stress patterns consistent with the abnormal behavior recorded by our monitoring system. They recommended immediate restrictions on occupancy in the affected section and a wider structural assessment. Building 4 was temporarily closed. That was the moment Rivergate stopped being a technical disagreement. The closure disrupted tenant operations. The project missed a contractual completion benchmark. Hale Development lost its early completion bonus and began receiving notices connected to delay costs, tenant disruption, corrective work, and insurance exposure. The claims being discussed exceeded $11 million. Grant reacted quickly, just not to the engineering problem. He reacted to the story. According to people who later spoke to me, he told Dad that North Star was an aggressive technology startup trying to prove its own product by exaggerating ordinary construction variation. He said the sensors were too sensitive. He said the inspection firm had been pressured by the insurer. He said Rivergate was being used as a test case. None of that matched the process I had seen, but Dad did not ask to see the process. That was the part that changed something in me. He did not request the critical review report. He did not ask who selected the independent engineers. He did not ask whether the inspection findings matched the sensor location. He listened to Grant. Then he chose a side. A week later, my cousin Caroline called me. She sounded uncomfortable. "Were you at the Piedmont Builders dinner?" "No." "Your dad spoke." "About what?" There was a pause. Technology companies getting between builders and common sense. I said nothing. Caroline continued carefully. He said real construction experience matters more than algorithms designed by people who have never carried responsibility for a project. I knew exactly where the language had come from. Grant. "What do you want me to say, Caroline?" "I thought you should know." "Now I know." She waited, probably expecting anger. I did not give her any. After the call, I opened the independent inspection report again. The document was 63 pages long. It contained photographs, measurements, material references, engineering calculations, and the locations of the non-conforming connections. No one reading it seriously could call it a marketing document. I closed the file. For years, I had assumed my father's opinion of me came from ignorance. I thought he did not understand my work because I had failed to explain it in a language he respected. Rivergate showed me something different. He had access to questions. He simply preferred Grant's answer. That distinction mattered. Ignorance could be corrected. Loyalty to a false narrative was harder. Ethan came into my office that afternoon with an updated compliance schedule. "You heard about your dad?" "Yes." "You want me to pretend I didn't?" "No." He sat down. "This is going to get ugly." "Probably." "You okay?" I looked at the schedule. "Yes." It was not completely true, but I was no longer confused. That was different. I instructed our teams to continue following Redwood Mutual's process exactly. No special statements, no defensive press release, no response to industry gossip. Grant wanted an argument. An argument would let him turn the issue into personality versus personality, brother versus sister, builder versus technologist. I would not give him that. The independent report existed, the digital access history existed, the written delay instruction existed, the legal hold protected the sequence. I did not need to win a conversation. I needed the record to remain intact. The corrective work at Building 4 began under independent engineering supervision. Redwood Mutual expanded its review of the project file. Hale Development's lawyers started challenging portions of the insurer's position, which was their right. But every formal challenge created another formal response. Every question required another document. The dispute was becoming larger, but it was also becoming clearer. That was the irony Grant did not understand yet. The harder he pushed the narrative that North Star had manufactured the problem, the more independent parties were required to examine the underlying facts. I did not celebrate that. Hale Development employed hundreds of people who had nothing to do with Grant's decisions. Contractors depended on the company. Families depended on those jobs. I did not want the business destroyed. I wanted the truth separated from whoever had the loudest voice in the room. For most of my life, my father had been that voice. At Rivergate, volume no longer controlled the process. The sensor system had identified a pattern. The server had recorded access. The email had preserved intent. The independent engineers had found physical conditions that confirmed the concern. And the legal hold meant the sequence could not be rewritten later. I finally understood that I did not have to convince my father of anything. That was no longer my job. My job was to make sure the truth survived long enough to be examined by people who were willing to look at it. Sentinel Risk Group first contacted us through an investment bank. The message was careful and vague. They wanted to discuss a strategic relationship involving North Star's technology, insurance partnerships, and future expansion. Ethan read the email and looked at me. "They want to buy us." "You got that from 3 paragraphs of corporate language?" They used the word synergy 4 times. He was right. Sentinel was much larger than North Star. It operated across insurance risk, engineering analysis, infrastructure consulting, and industrial compliance. We had worked around parts of its network before, but never directly at the executive level. The first meeting lasted 3 hours. The second lasted 6. By the fourth, there were lawyers on both sides of the table. Sentinel wanted control. Their argument was reasonable. North Star had proven the technology, but Sentinel had the distribution network to deploy it at a scale we could not reach alone. They had access to national insurance portfolios, infrastructure clients, and compliance systems that would take us years to build independently. The number eventually placed in front of us was based on a $920 million valuation. I stared at it for a few seconds, then I turned the page. Our banker looked surprised. "You want a minute?" "No, I want to see the IP terms." That was the part I cared about. Money could be divided. Ownership of the underlying technology was harder to recover once surrendered. Years earlier, when North Star began filing patents, I had created MHC Technologies as a separate intellectual property holding company. 3 core patents covering parts of our sensor architecture, signal interpretation, and structural risk analytics were held there. Sentinel's first proposal wanted everything. I said no. Their lead negotiator, a woman named Naomi Brooks, folded her hands on the table. "You understand the valuation assumes full control of the platform." "Control of North Star is one conversation," I said. "Ownership of the foundational patents is another." You would be licensing technology back to the company you just sold. I would be licensing it forward. She smiled slightly. That distinction matters to you? Very much. The negotiations lasted months. I was not trying to sabotage the deal. I believed Sentinel could take the technology farther than North Star could alone. But I had spent years learning the difference between revenue and ownership, between access and control. I was willing to sell control of the operating company. I was not willing to surrender every piece of the foundation. The final agreement reflected that. Sentinel acquired a controlling interest in North Star at the negotiated $920 million valuation. MHC Technologies retained ownership of the 3 core patents and granted Sentinel a long-term commercial license under defined terms. The documents were complicated. The principle was simple. I sold control of a company. I did not sell the part that made me unnecessary. After taxes, existing investor rights, transaction costs, and the structure of my remaining interests, my personal net worth was estimated at approximately $186 million. The number did not feel real. What felt real was the signature. I sat in a conference room after the closing and looked at my name on the final transaction documents. Ethan dropped into the chair beside me. "So," he said, "are you buying a yacht?" "No." "Island?" "No." "New Subaru?" I looked at him. "Maybe tires." He laughed so loudly, one of the lawyers turned around. The transaction changed more than my balance sheet. Sentinel asked me to stay. I became Executive Vice President of Structural Risk Technology, with responsibility for integrating North Star's systems into broader industrial risk operations. I also received a seat on Sentinel's Risk Audit Committee. That mattered more than the title. The committee reviewed patterns across insurance portfolios, technical disputes, compliance concerns, and cases where operational risk overlapped with financial exposure. For the first time, I could see how one technical signal connected to insurance decisions, credit concerns, vendor relationships, and governance. My world became much larger. My family noticed almost none of it. I told my mother that Sentinel had acquired control of North Star and that I would be staying in an executive role. She heard a simpler version. At Thanksgiving, I walked into her kitchen and heard her talking to Aunt Diane. "Maddie finally has some stability," Mom said. "A large company brought her in." I stopped in the doorway. Aunt Diane smiled at me. "Your mother says you're an executive now." "I am." "That must be such a relief after the startup years." I looked at my mother. She smiled proudly, as if my life had finally reached a form she could explain. "It worked out," I said. That was all. I could have corrected the story in one sentence. I could have told them the valuation. I could have explained the transaction structure, the patents, the licensing agreement, my committee role. But suddenly, the idea exhausted me. Not because the truth was embarrassing, because nobody had asked. They had spent years deciding what my company was. Now they had decided what had happened to it. In their version, I had finally been hired by adults. I let them keep the story. There was a strange bitterness in that decision, but also peace. For most of my 20s, some part of me had imagined a moment when I would place success in front of my father and force him to reconsider me. Now I had the kind of success that would have shocked him, and I no longer wanted to use it that way. Money was not an argument. Neither was a title. If I needed to announce my net worth at dinner to prove I deserved respect, then respect was not what I was receiving. So I went back to work. Sentinel began integrating North Star's data architecture into its larger compliance systems. The scale changed immediately. Instead of reviewing one facility at a time, teams could compare risk patterns across portfolios. A technical anomaly could be checked against inspection history. Inspection history could be compared with insurance claims. Project records could be compared across different properties, involving the same contractors, vendors, or ownership groups. Patterns that once lived in separate files could now be examined together. During one early risk audit committee meeting, Naomi presented a list of portfolios scheduled for expanded review. I saw Hale Development's name on one of the supporting pages. I did not react. Rivergate had already created a formal dispute. It made sense that related insured projects would receive additional scrutiny. Still, I immediately disclosed the relationship. My family controls hail development, I said. I need that reflected in the committee record. Naomi nodded. You'll remain informed where your technical knowledge is required. Any investigative decisions involving hail will be independently supervised. Good. No one in the room treated the disclosure as emotional. It was governance. That difference mattered to me. I had spent years inside a family where loyalty often meant avoiding difficult questions. Sentinel worked differently. A conflict did not disappear because it was uncomfortable. It was documented, managed, and reviewed. North Star's technology had started as a way to hear what structures were doing between inspections. Now it was becoming part of something larger. A system capable of comparing what companies said with what their records showed. I still lived quietly. I still avoided talking about money. My family still believed I had finally found a stable corporate job after years of experimenting. But the reality was recorded in documents they had never thought to look for. The acquisition agreement had my signature. The patent records had my company's name. The licensing rights were defined in contracts. My authority at Sentinel existed whether Richard respected it or not. For the first time in my life, the gap between who my family believed I was and who I had actually become was enormous. And I felt no urgency to close it. I had learned something from buildings. Pressure reveals weakness eventually. You do not have to shout at a structure to make the truth appear. Sometimes you only have to keep measuring. After the Sentinel transaction, my work changed in ways I was still learning to understand. At North Star, we had usually looked deeply at individual structures. One building, one baseline, one set of sensor readings. Sentinel could look sideways. Its systems connected technical files with insurance records, project histories, contractor information, claims data, and compliance documents. A detail that seemed ordinary in one file could become suspicious when compared with another system. Rivergate had already triggered additional due diligence on several insured properties connected to hail development. I knew the review was happening. I did not know what it would find. The first discrepancy came from a project in South Carolina. The file showed that a required inspection had been completed on a Tuesday afternoon. The report was signed, dated, and stored correctly. Nothing about the document looked unusual. Then an analyst compared the inspection time with the site's electronic access records. According to the gate system, neither inspector listed on the report had entered the property that day. The team checked whether they had used another entrance. No record. They checked temporary visitor logs. Nothing. Vehicle access data did not show their registered company vehicle either. That did not prove fraud by itself. Records could be incomplete. People could enter with another crew. Electronic systems could fail. So the analyst marked it as an anomaly. The second discrepancy came from two different projects. Each file contained electronically signed compliance documents. The names were different. The dates were different. The projects were in different states. But the signature metadata showed that both documents had been created from the same device. That was strange enough. The timing made it worse. One person was documented as working in North Carolina, while the second signature appeared on a project file in Georgia less than an hour later. Again, no conclusion was made. Just another anomaly. The third discrepancy involved materials. A project financing package listed one set of approved specifications. The invoices in the insurance file reflected purchases that did not fully match those specifications. The price differences were not enormous when viewed line by line. Across repeated orders, they became significant. The audit team sent me a preliminary briefing because some of the technical classifications involved North Star data architecture. I read the summary in my office. Then I read it again. 3 projects, 3 different types of inconsistency: access records, signature metadata, material invoices. None depended on Rivergate sensors. That mattered. Ethan came into my office while I was still reviewing the packet. You saw it? Yes. What do you think? I think there are discrepancies. He waited. That's all? That's all the records prove right now. He nodded slowly. Years earlier, I might have wanted to connect the dots immediately. By then, I understood the danger of reaching a conclusion before the evidence supported it. A pattern was not the same thing as proof, but it was enough to justify looking. I called Naomi Brooks and asked for a formal meeting with Sentinel's general counsel. We met that afternoon. Naomi sat across from me with two members of the compliance team and outside counsel joining by video. I put the preliminary packet on the table. "I need my role narrowed," one of the lawyers asked. "Because of the family relationship?" "Yes." "You already disclosed it." "Disclosure is not enough anymore. Rivergate could have been isolated. This may be broader." Naomi looked at me carefully. "What are you asking for?" "I want no authority over investigative scope, witness selection, or findings involving Hale development." The room stayed quiet. It was harder to say than I expected. I had built the technology that helped create part of the record. I understood the systems better than almost anyone involved. Every instinct in me wanted to stay close to the review. But if I controlled the investigation, Grant would eventually have an argument that had nothing to do with the evidence. He would say I was angry. He would say I had used Sentinel to target him. He would say the little sister who had never fit into Hale development had finally found a way to attack it. I knew my brother. If facts became dangerous, he would attack motive. I wanted that path closed before he could use it. Outside counsel proposed a structure. An independent audit team would control the expanded review. I could answer technical questions about North Star systems and Sentinel integration, but I would not decide where investigators looked next. I agreed. When the meeting ended, Naomi stayed behind. "You understand you may not know everything they find in real time." "I understand. And you may disagree with decisions." "I know." "You still want this?" "No," I said. "But I think it's necessary." That was the truth. People talk about power as the ability to control events. Sometimes power is knowing when your control would damage the credibility of the result. The independent team began by testing innocent explanations. They contacted the inspection firm connected to the South Carolina project. Scheduling records showed the inspectors had been assigned elsewhere on the date listed in the Hale file. They reviewed the electronic signature systems. The metadata was authentic. The same device had been used. They compared procurement records with financing disclosures. The material differences could not be explained entirely by approved change orders. The anomalies remained. Then the team widened the review. Not to every Hale development project, to vendor relationships. That shift changed the nature of the investigation. Until then, the questions had focused on whether construction and inspection records were accurate. Now the auditors wanted to know who supplied the materials, how vendors were selected, whether prices were consistent, and whether any relationships existed between vendors and Hale development decision-makers. I learned about the expanded scope through the committee process. No names were included in the first notice, only categories: vendor concentration, related party risk, pricing variance, beneficial ownership review. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Rivergate had been serious, but I could understand how a man under pressure might convince himself that delaying an inspection was temporary. 3 projects with different documentation problems suggested something else. Maybe carelessness, maybe weak controls, maybe coordinated misconduct. I did not know. And because I had stepped back, I could not simply open every file and search for an answer myself. That loss of access was uncomfortable. It was also correct. My mother called that weekend. She wanted to know whether I would attend a family dinner the following month. "Grant has been under terrible pressure," she said. "I'm sure he has. Your father thinks these insurance people are trying to make an example of the company." I looked out my office window. "Does Dad know what the review is about?" "He knows enough." That answer stayed with me. "What does that mean?" She sighed. "Maddie, I'm not calling to discuss business." "Then we shouldn't discuss business." Her voice cooled slightly. "You've become very formal." "No, I've become careful." We changed the subject. I did not tell her about the 3 projects. I did not tell her about the outside audit. I did not defend Sentinel. For once, silence was not weakness, it was discipline. The investigators continued working without me. The South Carolina access records remained unresolved. The electronic signatures remained inconsistent with location data. The invoice specifications remained inconsistent with financing documents. Each discrepancy had come from a different system. That was what made the pattern difficult to dismiss. One bad record could be an error, two could be weak administration. But when unrelated systems began contradicting the same company's official files, the question changed. The audit team no longer asked only whether Rivergate had been mishandled. They began asking whether Hale Development had developed a habit of making its records tell a cleaner story than its operations. I still did not know the answer. But the investigation had moved beyond my brother's explanation of an oversensitive technology company. North Star's sensors had opened one door. The records from other systems had opened 3 more. And now independent auditors were following the trail into the one place Grant had never expected anyone to examine closely: the money behind the projects. The name Blue Ridge Materials appeared often enough that the independent auditors stopped treating it as ordinary. At first, there was nothing obviously wrong with that. Construction companies used preferred vendors all the time. A supplier that delivered reliably could receive contracts across several projects without creating any problem. But Blue Ridge was unusual. The company had received millions of dollars in Hale Development business within a relatively short period. Its growth closely followed Grant's rise in operational authority. On some projects, it supplied materials directly. On others, it appeared through purchasing intermediaries or subcontractor arrangements. The auditors started with pricing. Then they looked at ownership. The public records were simple. Blue Ridge Materials belonged to a man named Darren Pike. I had never heard of him. Neither had most people at Sentinel. The auditors searched ordinary corporate records first: registration documents, annual filings, business addresses, public liens. Nothing connected Darren Pike to Grant. That could have ended the question. It did not. Because the Rivergate insurance dispute had moved into formal discovery, financial records connected to several disputed transactions became available through the legal process. The auditors compared payments from Hale Development projects with transfers made by Blue Ridge and affiliated entities. The money did not move directly from Blue Ridge to Grant. It moved through layers. Blue Ridge paid management and consulting fees to another entity. That entity transferred funds under a different service agreement. Part of those funds eventually reached an LLC in which Grant held an indirect beneficial interest. The first time Naomi showed me the summary, I did not speak. We were in a restricted conference room at Sentinel. Outside counsel had approved a limited briefing because my committee responsibilities required awareness of potential governance exposure. Naomi slid a chart toward me. Boxes, arrows, dates, amounts. At the left was Hale Development. At the right was an LLC I had never seen before. Between them were Blue Ridge Materials and 2 affiliated entities. I followed the arrows twice. "Is this confirmed?" I asked. "The transfers are confirmed." "Purpose?" "Described as consulting, management, and advisory services." "Were services documented?" "Not adequately." I looked at the final box. "And Grant?" "Beneficial interest through a holding arrangement." The room seemed very quiet. Grant had helped direct business toward a vendor. Money from that vendor network had reached an entity connected to him. That did not automatically establish every possible legal conclusion. The lawyers were careful about that. But it created a conflict that should have been disclosed. It had not been. I asked one question. "Does Dad know?" Naomi shook her head. "We have no evidence of that." I nodded. I wanted the answer to matter more than it did. Then the auditors found Lucas. Not his name on a bank transfer, his work in the corporate history. The LLC connected to Grant had been formed using legal documents prepared through a firm where Lucas handled real estate and corporate matters. The engagement records did not say, "Create a secret company for my brother." Real life was rarely that convenient. The documents looked ordinary. Formation paperwork, operating provisions, ownership language, management rights. But Lucas had worked on the structure. That meant he knew it existed. The question became how much else he knew. Outside counsel requested archived communications relevant to the formation and subsequent vendor relationships. The email search produced hundreds of messages. Most were useless: scheduling, drafts, routine legal questions. Then the audit team found an exchange between Lucas and Grant. The first email from Lucas was cautious. He warned that the structure could create serious disclosure problems if a lender or insurer examined the beneficial ownership behind related vendors. He recommended separation from procurement decisions and formal disclosure. I read that paragraph several times. Lucas had seen the risk. Not years later. Not after Rivergate. At the time the structure was being used. Grant's reply was shorter. If Rivergate delivers on time, nobody is going to dig that deep. I felt something inside me drop. There it was. Not proof of every allegation anyone might eventually make, but proof of knowledge. Grant understood that deeper review could expose the relationship, and Lucas understood it too. I had spent years thinking of my brothers differently. Grant was the favored one, confident, aggressive, protected by Dad. Lucas was the careful one, the reasonable one, the brother who sometimes looked uncomfortable when Dad went too far. I had mistaken discomfort for resistance. They were not the same thing. I thought about the conversation years earlier when Lucas had told me Grant did not know how to tell Dad something was going wrong. At the time, I had heard concern. Now I wondered whether I had been hearing an excuse. Naomi closed the email packet. You don't need to make any decisions on this. I know. The independent team is handling it. I know. She studied me. You look angry. I'm not sure that's the word. What is? I looked at the ownership chart again. Disappointed. That sounded weak, but it was accurate. I already knew Grant could make bad decisions under pressure. I had watched him turn Rivergate into a narrative war rather than face the underlying problem. Lucas was different. He had recognized the danger. He had written it down. Then he had stayed inside the system anyway. That was harder for me to understand. The vendor audit expanded. Investigators compared Blue Ridge pricing with market ranges. They reviewed contract awards, change orders, approval authority, and communications between project managers and senior leadership. The legal concern was no longer limited to whether Hale Development had followed proper construction procedures. Now the questions involved fiduciary duty, related party transactions, conflict disclosure, potential misrepresentation to insurers and lenders. The financial trail also explained something that had confused the auditors earlier. Why keep pushing projects forward when the margins were deteriorating? The answer was becoming more complicated. Hale Development's profitability was one issue. Grant's private financial interest in parts of the vendor network was another. The incentives were not necessarily aligned. That realization changed the entire risk picture. I was briefed only on what my committee role required. That boundary frustrated me, but it also protected the investigation. Grant could not honestly say I had personally searched his banking records. I had not. He could not say I selected the vendor audit targets. I had not. He could not say I instructed lawyers to find Lucas's emails. I had not. Independent professionals had followed discrepancies from project files into vendor relationships, from vendor relationships into ownership records, and from ownership records into banking flows. The trail had moved on its own logic. That was exactly why I had stepped back. My mother called me during that period and asked if I had spoken to Lucas. Not recently. He's worried about Grant. I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, because I now knew how incomplete that sentence was. What is he worried about? I asked. Stress, the company, your father. Has Lucas told Dad what he thinks? She hesitated. You know your brother. He doesn't like conflict. I looked at the printed committee notes on my desk. No, I said quietly. He doesn't. My mother kept talking, but I barely heard her. For years, Lucas's silence had been treated as maturity. Grant acted. Dad commanded. Mom managed appearances. Lucas stayed calm. Now I understood that calm people could help dangerous systems survive just as effectively as loud people, sometimes more effectively. After the call, I sat alone for a while. I did not feel the same cold focus I had felt after Rivergate. This was different. Rivergate had forced me to separate family from professional duty. The Blue Ridge Trail forced me to reconsider the family itself. Grant had crossed lines. Lucas had seen some of those lines and helped build legal walls around the structure instead of exposing the risk. Dad had created a family where challenging Grant meant challenging the future he had already chosen. Each person had played a different role. That did not make the consequences equal, but it made the pattern clearer. A few days later, the independent audit team issued a formal expansion notice. The review would now include related party transactions, beneficial ownership disclosures, vendor selection procedures, and representations made in financing documents. That final category caught my attention. Financing documents. If Hale Development had borrowed money while failing to disclose material conflicts or risks, the problem would no longer belong only to insurers and project partners. Lenders would have questions, boards would have duties, lawyers would have to explain what they knew and when they knew it. The investigation had started with a building that behaved differently from its baseline. Then the records had contradicted one another. Now the money was telling its own story. Hale Development had paid Blue Ridge Materials. Blue Ridge's network had moved money through affiliated entities. A portion of that flow reached an LLC tied to Grant. Lucas had helped create the structure. Lucas had warned Grant about disclosure risk. Grant had answered that nobody would look if Rivergate finished on time. Rivergate had not finished cleanly. And now people were looking. I had spent most of my life believing Grant was the brother protected by the family system, and Lucas was simply standing beside it. I finally understood the truth. Standing beside a system while helping it stay hidden was still a choice. I learned about the succession plan through a conflict review. Not because I was supposed to inherit Hale Development. I wasn't. I had never worked there, never owned shares in the company, and never expected my father to divide control equally among his children. That was not the issue. The issue was timing. Sentinel's outside counsel was reviewing governance relationships connected to Hale Development when the existence of a pending succession structure became relevant. If Grant was about to receive controlling voting power while related party transactions and disclosure questions were under investigation, the transfer could affect the risk analysis. Because of my family relationship, I received only a limited briefing. The summary was enough. Richard planned to transfer 51% of Hale Development's voting control to Grant over a 2-year period. Lucas would receive non-voting equity. My interest was outside the operating company entirely. A family trust assigned me an interest in an old vacation house and my grandmother's silver collection. I read the summary without reacting. Naomi was sitting across from me. "You knew about this?" "No." "Does it surprise you?" I considered the question. "The structure doesn't." "The timing?" "Yes." That was the honest answer. Grant had always been the heir. Lucas had always been the advisor. I had always been outside the company. But the succession plan was being prepared while Rivergate was under dispute, vendor relationships were being examined, and Hale Development's financial exposure was becoming more serious. Richard was not slowing down. He was accelerating the transfer. Later, outside counsel identified an email relevant to the governance review. Richard had sent it to the attorney helping prepare the family succession documents. The wording was not cruel. That almost made it worse. He described Grant as the only child with the experience and judgment necessary to protect the Hale legacy. Lucas, he wrote, understood legal structures but was not an operator. Then he mentioned me. Maddie had chosen a different life and had no meaningful experience managing real assets. I sat with that sentence longer than I should have. Real assets. At that point, MHC Industrial Holdings owned North Star's former operating property. MHC Technologies held 3 foundational patents under a licensing structure negotiated during a $920 million transaction. My estimated personal net worth was around $186 million. I had built a company, managed investors, negotiated commercial agreements, acquired industrial property, and entered an executive role inside one of the largest risk organizations in our sector. My father believed I had no experience managing real assets. For one brief moment, I wanted to laugh. Then I realized there was nothing funny about it. The email showed me that Richard's view of me had survived every year since I left Charlotte because he had never tested it. He had not misunderstood one decision. He had built an entire permanent conclusion from it. I had chosen a life outside Hale Development, so in his mind, nothing I accomplished outside Hale Development could qualify me to understand business. The logic was circular and convenient. That evening I called Ethan. We rarely talked about my family unless something directly affected the company, but I needed to hear a voice from a part of my life that existed before Sentinel. "Can I ask you something strange?" "Always." "Did we build a real company?" He was silent. Then he said, "Did you hit your head?" "I'm serious." "Maddie, I spent 8 years arguing with you about payroll, product deadlines, hiring plans, insurance contracts, and investors. So either we built a company or we participated in the longest group hallucination in North Carolina." I smiled despite myself. "Okay. What happened?" "Nothing I want to talk about yet." He did not push. "Then my answer is yes. Very real. Annoyingly real." After the call, I understood what had bothered me. It was not inheritance. I did not want Hale Development. I had spent my adult life building something separate because I wanted it separate. What hurt was seeing that my father had turned his lack of curiosity into a legal judgment about my competence. And he was doing it while preparing to hand control to a son whose decisions were already threatening the company. The contradiction was difficult to ignore. Grant was being investigated for undisclosed financial interests connected to company vendors. Richard's response was to strengthen Grant's path to control. Lucas had written warnings about disclosure risk. Richard's plan rewarded him with equity, but no operating authority, preserving his role as the quiet professional near the center of power. And I was assigned objects, a house, silver, memories instead of influence. My mother called a few days later. She was discussing renovations to the vacation property. "Your father thinks you'll appreciate having something sentimental someday." I looked at the succession summary on my desk. Did he say that? What? That I'd appreciate something sentimental. Well, not exactly, but you know what he means. I did. That was the problem. "Mom, has Dad already decided Grant will control the company?" Silence. Then she said, "Why are you asking?" "Because I'm asking. That has always been the general understanding." "Even now?" Her voice changed. "What does that mean?" "Nothing." "Maddie." I stopped myself. I could not discuss an active independent review with her. "I'm asking whether Dad ever reconsidered the plan." "Why would he?" The answer came quickly, naturally, as if there were no imaginable reason. I looked out the window. "No reason," I said. After we hung up, I did not feel angry. I felt clear. That was new. For years, I had told myself Dad simply did not know what I was doing. Then Rivergate showed me he would defend Grant before reviewing evidence. The Blue Ridge Trail showed me Lucas had recognized risk and chosen silence. The succession documents completed the picture. My family's hierarchy was not an accident, it was a system. Grant received authority because Richard believed he was meant to lead. Lucas received protection because he made problems manageable. I received distance because I had refused the role prepared for me. Once I understood that, several old memories changed shape. Dad's lack of questions was not forgetfulness. Mom's descriptions of my work were not harmless simplifications. Grant's confidence was not built only from talent. Each of us had been assigned a position, and the family had spent years collecting only the information that supported those positions. The independent investigation continued separately from me. I did not use the succession documents to attack Richard. I did not call Grant. I did not tell Lucas I had seen evidence of his earlier warning. There was nothing useful I could gain from confrontation. The documents had already done what mattered. They explained motive. Grant was not simply trying to save one troubled project. He was approaching the transfer of control he had expected his entire life. Failure at Rivergate could threaten more than a bonus or promotion. It could make Richard question whether the chosen heir was ready. That gave Grant a powerful reason to keep problems contained, to protect the schedule, to control the story, to make financial pressure disappear long enough for succession to become permanent. The auditors did not need family psychology to establish facts. But I needed it to understand my brother. Grant had grown up believing Hale Development was his future. Now that future was close enough to touch, and the closer he got, the more dangerous every unresolved problem became. I closed the succession summary and placed it back in the restricted file. My father thought he was protecting the Hale legacy by choosing the right son. He had never considered that the certainty of being chosen might be exactly what made Grant believe he could keep taking bigger risks. For the first time, I stopped wondering when my father would understand me. I had a different question now. How much was Grant willing to hide to become the man Richard had already decided he was? Hale Development's cash problem did not appear all at once. It accumulated. Rivergate had lost its early completion bonus. Corrective work at Building 4 required money. Insurance claims remained unresolved. Delays affected expected payments, while other projects still needed crews, materials, and subcontractors. A company could have valuable assets and a strong project pipeline while still running short of cash. Grant needed time. Again. This time cost $28 million. Hale Development applied for a bridge loan secured primarily against expected receivables from active projects. The plan was to use the money to stabilize operations until delayed payments arrived and several large projects reached billing milestones. The loan itself was not unusual. The disclosures were. The bank required information about material disputes, pending insurance claims, project delays, and any conditions that could affect the receivables being used to support the loan. The original application described Hale Development as facing ordinary project-level disagreements that had either been resolved or were not expected to create material financial exposure. By then, that statement was difficult to defend. Rivergate alone involved claims and potential exposure exceeding $11 million. The vendor investigation had expanded. Questions about related party transactions were unresolved, and the independent review had identified documentation anomalies across multiple projects. The bank asked for an update. What happened next became one of the most important parts of the record. A revised disclosure summary was prepared. The new version acknowledged some project disputes in broad language, but the critical review report from Rivergate was not included. Neither were the 3 sensor warnings that had led to mandatory inspection. The summary described Building 4 as a technical disagreement, followed by precautionary corrective work. I read that language later and understood immediately why it mattered. A disagreement suggested uncertainty. The actual sequence was not uncertain. The sensors had recorded repeated deviations. A formal report had recommended inspection. Grant had accessed the report. Inspection had been delayed. 2 additional warnings had followed. Independent engineers had then confirmed non-conforming load-bearing connections in the affected zone. That sequence had been reduced to a disagreement. Grant approved the revised disclosure package for submission. The approval trail was electronic. Name, account, timestamp, another record. Richard's role was different. Outside counsel found no evidence that he drafted the misleading language or selected the documents removed from the package. What they found was more complicated. An internal exchange showed Richard had been told that the loan materials had been cleaned up to avoid giving unnecessary weight to unresolved technical matters. He did not ask what had been removed. Instead, he replied that the company could not afford distractions before the 40th anniversary gala and Grant's presidential announcement. That was the moment my father crossed a line of his own. Not Grant's line, his. Richard had spent years presenting himself as the adult in every room, the builder, the man who understood risk because he had survived recessions, lawsuits, failed projects, and difficult partners. But when the future he wanted came under pressure, he chose not to ask a question. I knew that kind of silence now. Lucas had used it. Richard was using it too. The bank reviewed the updated package and was not satisfied. Its credit team requested an urgent meeting with Hale Development leadership. Grant delayed. He said the finance team needed time to assemble additional project information. The bank requested a second meeting. Grant's office asked to reschedule because of conflicts connected to the company's anniversary events. The bank tried a third time. This request was more direct. Senior credit officers wanted Richard, Grant, and legal representation present. Richard refused. His response, according to the correspondence later reviewed by counsel, was that Hale Development would not allow lenders to create panic over ordinary business disputes. Lucas finally pushed back. He recommended postponing the public succession announcement until the financing questions were resolved. Richard rejected the idea. The gala had already been planned for months. Clients were coming. Lenders were invited. Industry press had confirmed attendance. Political figures and development partners were expected. Richard believed postponing Grant's promotion would signal weakness. Worse, he believed a public display of confidence would strengthen Hale Development's position. If clients, partners, and the market saw Grant formally elevated to president during the company's 40th anniversary celebration, Richard thought the bank would have less room to treat the company as unstable. It was an extraordinary calculation. He was using reputation as collateral, and for most of his career, that strategy had probably worked. Richard Hale had built a company people trusted. He believed that trust could carry the family through one more difficult season. What he did not understand was that the problem had moved beyond reputation. Sentinel's independent investigation was nearing completion. The evidence chain no longer depended on one source. Technical warnings showed the Rivergate risk. Server records showed Grant accessed the report. His written instruction connected inspection delay to the lender review. Physical inspection confirmed the structural concern. Cross-project analysis identified additional documentation anomalies. Vendor tracing exposed the Blue Ridge financial relationship. Banking records connected the vendor network to Grant's beneficial interest. Lucas's email showed prior knowledge of disclosure risk. And now the loan package created a new question. Whether Hale Development had obtained or attempted to obtain credit using incomplete or misleading information. Sentinel had obligations that could not be ignored. The bank had financial exposure connected to insured projects within the reviewed portfolio. Once outside counsel completed its findings, formal notification became necessary. I was informed during a restricted committee meeting. Naomi spoke first. The investigation team is preparing the notification package. When? Before the gala. I looked at her. Has the bank scheduled another meeting? They've attempted 3. I know. They believe Hale leadership will all be present at the anniversary event. I understood what she was saying. Richard and Grant had avoided private rooms. Now they had created a public room where attendance was guaranteed. I don't want an ambush, I said. Neither do we. Then why the gala? The bank intends to request a private meeting on site before any public action. Sentinel representatives will be there because technical evidence forms part of the notification. I knew the next sentence before she said it. They need you available. I leaned back. For what? To confirm the integrity of the North Star evidence architecture and chain of custody if challenged. My conflict? Already documented. You are not presenting investigative conclusions. You are confirming the technical system you built and the preservation process you authorized. I looked down at the briefing packet. For years, I had imagined that if my family ever learned the truth about my work, it would happen because I chose to tell them. I had never imagined this. Not a victory speech, not a dramatic announcement about money, a technical responsibility. I asked, "Can someone else do it?" Yes. That surprised me. Naomi continued, "But Grant has already suggested North Star manipulated the Rivergate findings. If that argument is raised, your testimony about the system design and preservation procedures may be material." I thought about the choice carefully. This was no longer about correcting my father's opinion. It was about whether a documented evidence system could be dismissed as a personal attack. "I'll attend," I said. The decision felt different from everything before it. There was no hesitation left. I had given Grant the benefit of procedure. I had stepped away from investigative decisions. I had allowed outside counsel and independent auditors to follow the records wherever they led. They had led to Rivergate, then to other projects, then to Blue Ridge, then to Grant's financial interest, then to Lucas's warning, then to the loan package. The sequence was no longer a family interpretation, it was a chain. A week before the gala, my mother called. She sounded excited. "You are coming, aren't you?" "Yes." "Good. Your father wants everyone there when Grant is announced." I looked at the formal Sentinel attendance notice on my desk. "I'll be there." She lowered her voice. "Whatever business tension is happening, please don't let it affect the evening." I was quiet for a moment. "Mom, I'm not controlling what happens." "You know what I mean." I did. She wanted the family picture to remain intact. Richard at the center, Grant receiving the company, Lucas standing nearby, me smiling from the edge. For 40 years, Hale Development had built a reputation around Richard's certainty. The gala was supposed to prove that certainty had been inherited. Instead, Richard and Grant had made one mistake after another to protect the event itself. They avoided the first bank meeting, then the second, then the third. They pushed the succession announcement forward because they believed a crowded ballroom would make them stronger. By then, I understood something they did not. A private room would have allowed difficult questions to stay private. The gala would contain lenders, clients, partners, executives, attorneys, and people from the industry press. Richard believed those witnesses were protection. I knew witnesses worked both ways. I closed the loan disclosure file. The technical record was preserved. The financial trail had been traced. The investigation was complete enough to trigger mandatory notification. And for the first time since Rivergate began, I was no longer waiting to understand what my family would do. They had already chosen. Grant chose concealment. Lucas chose caution without disclosure. Richard chose image over inquiry. I chose the record. Now all of those choices were moving toward the same room. The Grand Regent Hotel in Charlotte was exactly the kind of place my mother loved. Polished marble floors, gold lighting, tall floral arrangements that made every table look expensive before anyone sat down. A ballroom large enough to make a regional construction company feel national for one evening. Hale Development's name was projected across the far wall in clean white letters. 40 years of building the future. Under it, smaller words. The Hale Legacy. I stood near the entrance for a moment and watched people move through the room. Clients, bankers, developers, subcontractors, local officials, former employees, industry reporters, people who knew my father as a serious man who built serious things. More than 300 guests had come to celebrate him, and Grant, mostly Grant. My mother had texted me that morning, "Please come on time. Please be happy for your brother. And Maddie, please don't make tonight about whatever work tension is happening." I had stared at that message longer than I should have. Work tension. That was what she called it. Not warnings, not records, not a loan disclosure problem, not an investigation large enough to require lawyers, auditors, and a bank notification. Work tension. I typed back, "I'll be there." I wore a simple navy dress and low heels because I knew I might be standing for a long time. In my small clutch were my ID, my phone, and a printed copy of Sentinel's attendance notice. I did not bring documents to reveal anything. That was not my role. I was there as two people. Richard Hale's daughter, and the person Sentinel might need to confirm the integrity of North Star's technical data if the bank challenged the evidence chain. Those roles sat beside each other inside me all night, quiet and heavy. My mother saw me before my father did. She crossed the ballroom with the controlled smile she used when important people were watching. "Maddie," she said, kissing the air beside my cheek, "you look nice." "Thank you." She glanced at my dress. Simple, good choice. With my mother, compliments often arrived already trimmed. She lowered her voice. "Your father is under a lot of pressure tonight. Grant, too. Just be mindful. I know what tonight means." Her face softened, but not enough to become understanding. "It means everything to him." I looked toward the stage, where a large photo of my father in front of his first completed commercial project was displayed on a screen. I know. What I did not say was that meaning did not erase responsibility. Grant stood near the center of the room, surrounded by men in dark suits who laughed when he laughed. He looked polished, energized, almost relieved. If Rivergate had exhausted him, the Gala had restored something in him. A public stage did that for Grant. It made uncertainty look like confidence. Lucas stood a few feet away, speaking quietly with a banker I recognized from the briefing materials. He looked composed, but not relaxed. His eyes kept moving around the room, measuring exits, groups, conversations. He saw me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he nodded. I nodded back. That was all. My father found me 10 minutes later. He was wearing a black tuxedo and the expression of a man who believed the room belonged to him because he had earned every inch of it. "Maddie," he said, "glad you came." I said I would. He gave me a brief smile. "Your mother worries." I noticed. His eyes moved over my shoulder, already searching for someone more important to greet. "Tonight is about your brother. It would mean a lot if you could remember that." I looked at him carefully. "I'll remember exactly what tonight is about." He did not hear the difference. The program began at 7:30. Dinner had been served. Glasses were full. The stage lights warmed the front of the ballroom. My family sat at the central table. Grant was at Dad's right, Lucas at his left, my mother beside Grant. I was placed farther down, close enough to be included in family photographs, not close enough to be part of the main conversation. That arrangement was familiar. It did not hurt the way it once had. Across the room, I saw Naomi Brooks enter with 2 people from Sentinel and a man from the bank's senior credit team. They did not approach the stage. They moved toward a side area near the private meeting rooms. Naomi saw me and gave the smallest nod. Not dramatic, not secretive, a professional acknowledgement. The evidence had already moved from investigation phase to notification phase. No one needed a performance. My father stepped onto the stage to applause. He waited for it to settle. He was good at that. He understood timing. He knew how to make silence feel respectful. 40 years ago, he began, I had a truck, 3 employees, and a belief that if you build with integrity, people remember your name. The room applauded again. I watched him speak about early projects, sleepless nights, recessions, lawsuits survived, partnerships built. He thanked clients. He thanked employees. He thanked people who had trusted Hale Development before it had a reputation. Then his voice warmed. And of course, none of this means anything without family. My mother smiled at the head table. Dad turned slightly toward us. My wife, Cynthia, has carried the Hale name with more grace than I deserve. People applauded. My son Lucas has protected this company through complex years, with the kind of legal mind every business hopes to have in the family. Lucas gave a restrained smile. And Grant. Dad paused. The room already knew where this was going. Grant has spent his life learning not just how buildings are constructed, but how trust is constructed. He understands clients. He understands risk. He understands growth. He represents the next era of Hale Development. Grant lowered his head modestly, perfectly. Then Dad looked down the table toward me. And Maddie. A few faces turned. My daughter chose a different path, a more technical path. And I'm proud to say she has finally found a stable place in the safety and inspection side of the industry. There it was, soft enough to sound kind, small enough to erase almost everything. A few people smiled politely at me. My mother's expression said I should accept the compliment. I did. I lifted my glass a fraction and gave the room the version of a smile that asked nothing from anyone. Dad continued. Every family has different strengths. Tonight we celebrate the strength that will carry Hale Development forward. He turned to Grant. It is my honor to announce that Grant Hale will become president of Hale Development and Construction. The applause was immediate, loud, standing in places. Grant rose, hugged my father, and stepped to the microphone. He looked exactly like the future Richard had spent years describing. For several minutes, Grant gave the speech people expected. He thanked Dad, he thanked Mom, he thanked Lucas. He talked about job sites, loyal clients, hard hats, long drives, and the responsibility of carrying a name larger than himself. Then his tone shifted. He began speaking about challenges facing the construction industry: rising costs, regulatory pressure, insurance complexity, technology firms that, in his words, mistake data points for wisdom. I became very still. Grant smiled at the crowd. We live in a time when companies can make a lot of money by telling builders that ordinary problems are disasters waiting to happen. They sell fear, package it as innovation, and ask the people who actually build things to apologize for knowing the difference. A few people applauded. Not everyone, but enough. Grant continued. Hale Development will always use technology where it helps, but we will never let outsiders, who have never carried the weight of a project, tell us that numbers on a dashboard matter more than experience, judgment, and common sense. My father clapped first. My mother followed. I watched Grant stand under the lights, attacking North Star, without knowing who he was attacking. The company he dismissed as selling fear had preserved the first record that now threatened his promotion. The dashboard he mocked had noticed what his team delayed. The outsider he described was sitting at his family table. I felt no urge to stand, no urge to speak. That surprised me. Years earlier, I might have wanted to correct him, to defend the work, to tell the room that experience without honesty was not judgment. But I had already learned that arguments could be twisted. Records were harder. Grant finished to strong applause, though some guests from the banking and insurance tables remained seated longer than others. He returned to the family table, flushed with victory. My mother squeezed his hand. Dad looked almost emotional. Lucas reached for his water glass and did not drink. Across the room, Naomi Brooks stood with the bank representative near the side corridor. A hotel staff member directed them toward one of the private meeting rooms. The first request would be private. That had always been the plan. But Grant's speech had changed the air. He had not just celebrated himself. He had publicly framed the coming questions as an attack by outsiders who did not understand real construction. That made what happened next inevitable in a different way, because the room had heard him. The lenders had heard him, the insurers had heard him, the reporters had heard him, and I had heard him. My father leaned toward me as dessert plates were being placed. "See?" he said quietly. "That's leadership." I looked at Grant, then at the side corridor where Naomi had disappeared with the bank representative. "No," I said softly. "That's confidence." Dad frowned. "There's a difference?" I turned back to him. "Yes." He did not ask what I meant. He never did, when the answer might disturb the story he preferred. A few minutes later, a hotel coordinator approached Lucas and whispered something. Lucas's face tightened. He stood and went to Grant. Grant's smile faded as Lucas spoke into his ear. Then both of them looked toward our father. Richard stood slowly. From the side of the ballroom, Naomi Brooks stepped back into view. She was not rushing. She did not need to. The room still hummed with celebration, but at the center table, the evening had already changed. I set my napkin beside my plate. For 40 years, Richard Hale had built a company around the power of his name. For one night, he had gathered everyone who believed in that name into a single room. He thought that made the legacy stronger. He had not considered that it also gave the truth witnesses. The first conversation was supposed to happen in private. That mattered to me. Despite everything, no one from Sentinel had arrived at the Grand Regent, intending to turn a corporate investigation into entertainment. The bank representative had reserved a private meeting room. Naomi Brooks and the independent audit team were prepared to present the findings there. Richard had another idea. When Lucas told him the bank wanted an immediate meeting, Dad looked toward the ballroom, then toward the corridor. "Tomorrow morning." Lucas lowered his voice. "Dad, they've already asked 3 times. And I answered, "No." We delayed. Grant stepped closer. "This is not the place." Naomi had reached us by then. She spoke calmly. Mr. Hale, the bank has a contractual obligation to address material information affecting its credit exposure. Dad looked at her. And you are? Naomi Brooks, Chief Risk Officer, Sentinel Risk Group. My father's expression changed slightly. He knew Sentinel. Everyone in the industry did. The bank representative introduced himself next and asked again for a private meeting. Grant shook his head. Not tonight. Mr. Hale, we just announced a leadership transition in front of 300 people. If you have routine credit questions, my finance team can answer them Monday. The banker's expression hardened. These are not routine questions. Several people near our table had stopped talking. A local business reporter was close enough to notice the tension. So were two major Hale development clients. Richard saw them watching. That made him more defensive. What exactly are you suggesting? Naomi glanced toward the private corridor. We should discuss that away from the ballroom. Grant gave a short laugh. No, I'm tired of people making vague accusations and hiding behind process. If this is about Rivergate, say it. Lucas closed his eyes for half a second. I understood immediately. Grant thought public confidence was still an advantage. He wanted witnesses. Naomi looked at the bank representative. He gave a small nod. Then she turned toward me. Ms. Hale, would you join us, please? My father frowned. Grant looked irritated. Naomi continued, clearly enough for the people nearest us to hear. Madeline Hale, founder of North Star Structural Systems, Executive Vice President of Structural Risk Technology at Sentinel Risk Group, and member of Sentinel's Risk Audit Committee. Silence spread outward from our table, not across the entire ballroom at once, first around us, then farther. My mother stared at Naomi. I'm sorry, she said. Founder of what? Naomi looked at her. North Star Structural Systems? Grant's face changed. He looked at me, then back at Naomi. That's not possible. I said nothing. Naomi did. North Star was acquired as part of a transaction based on a $920 million valuation. My mother sat down slowly. Dad remained standing. His eyes stayed on me. $920 million? The transaction details are a matter of corporate record, Naomi said. Ms. Hale founded North Star and retained significant intellectual property interests through MHC Technologies. Grant looked at me. MHC? I nodded once. Naomi continued. MHC Technologies owns 3 core patents licensed under the Sentinel transaction. For years, my family had called North Star a research project, then warehouse checking, then a little technology company, then a stable corporate job someone else had finally given me. Now every version disappeared in less than a minute. I felt strangely calm. I'd imagined moments like this when I was younger. In those fantasies, my father apologized. Grant looked ashamed. My mother finally understood. The real moment felt different. I did not need any of that anymore. The bank representative opened a folder. Mr. Hale, the purpose of our attempted meetings was to discuss material discrepancies in Hale Development's credit disclosures. Richard looked away from me. What discrepancies? The banker answered directly. Hale Development is in violation of credit covenants requiring accurate disclosure of material disputes and conditions affecting pledged receivables. Grant stepped forward. That's ridiculous. The independent auditor beside Naomi opened a second file. We have prepared a verified chronology. Grant pointed toward me. Verified by her? No, the auditor said. Ms. Hale recused herself from investigative decisions involving Hale Development. The review was conducted by independent audit personnel and outside counsel. Grant's mouth closed. The auditor began with Rivergate. He did not dramatize anything. That made it worse. The first critical review report had documented abnormal structural behavior at Building 4. The report had been distributed through authenticated channels. The server access log showed that Grant's account opened it at 9:42 the following morning. Grant interrupted. Opening an email doesn't mean I accepted its conclusions. No one said it did, the auditor replied. He continued. After the report was opened, Grant sent a written instruction delaying the recommended inspection until after lender review. The second warning arrived 17 days after the first. The third crossed the mandatory escalation threshold. Independent engineers then inspected the identified area and confirmed non-conforming load-bearing connections consistent with the monitored anomaly. Grant looked around the room. "This was already disputed," the banker answered. "The existence of a dispute was not the disclosure issue. The omission of material facts from the loan package was." The auditor moved to the next group of records. An inspection date on another Hale project did not match site access logs. Electronic signature metadata from 2 project files traced supposedly separate signatures to the same device despite recorded locations in different states. Material invoices on another project did not match specifications submitted in financing records. The ballroom was nearly silent now. No one had announced that a presentation was beginning. No microphone had been turned on. But people had moved closer. Clients stood near the edge of the conversation. Employees watched from behind tables. The local reporter was taking notes openly. Dad noticed. "Everyone needs to step back," he said. The banker looked at him. "Mr. Hale, we attempted to address these matters privately on 3 occasions." That sentence landed harder than anything dramatic could have. Dad had wanted the room. Now the room knew why it existed. The auditor continued with Blue Ridge Materials. Millions in Hale development contracts. Beneficial ownership review. Affiliated entities. Banking transfers. The flow of funds that eventually reached an LLC, in which Grant held an indirect beneficial interest. Grant's face turned red. "That is a legitimate investment structure. Then why wasn't it disclosed?" the banker asked. Grant looked toward Lucas. Lucas did not help him. The auditor placed one printed email on the table. "We also reviewed archived correspondence regarding the structure." Lucas went pale. I knew which email it was before the auditor read the relevant portion. Lucas had warned Grant that the arrangement created disclosure risk if a lender or insurer examined beneficial ownership behind related vendors. Grant had replied that if Rivergate delivered on time, no one would look that deeply. Dad turned toward Lucas. "You knew about this?" Lucas swallowed. "I knew there was exposure." "How much?" "I didn't know everything they found." "That wasn't my question." Lucas looked around the room, then back at Dad. "I warned Grant." "And then?" Lucas said nothing. The auditor asked, "Did you report the related party risk to the Hale Development Board?" "No." "Why not?" Lucas's eyes moved toward our father. The answer came quietly. "Because Dad wanted problems handled inside the family." My mother whispered his name. "Lucas." But he kept looking at Richard. "You always said we protect the company by protecting each other." Dad's face tightened. "I never told you to hide misconduct." "No," Lucas said. "You just made it clear what happened to anyone who challenged Grant." That was the first moment the room stopped feeling like a corporate meeting. Not because voices rose, because the family truth had finally entered the record. Richard looked at Lucas as if he had betrayed him, then at Grant, then at me. For most of my life, Dad had believed family loyalty meant keeping conflict contained. Grant learned that problems could be delayed. Lucas learned that warnings could remain private. My mother learned to turn uncomfortable facts into acceptable stories. I had been the only one who left the system, and they had called me the failure for doing it. The auditor moved to the loan documents, the original application, the bank's request for updated information, the revised disclosure summary, the omitted critical review report, the missing sensor warning history, the description of Building 4 as a technical disagreement followed by precautionary corrective work, then the approval trail, Grant's account, Grant's authorization, Grant's timestamp. The banker closed his folder. "Based on the information formally provided to us today, the bank is suspending further availability under the bridge facility pending full review. Existing defaults and remedies are being evaluated." My father stared at him. "You're freezing the loan?" "We are suspending availability." Do you understand what that does to an operating construction company? Yes. Then give us 48 hours. We attempted 3 urgent meetings. Again, the same fact. 3 chances. 3 delays. Grant turned toward me. This is what you wanted. I looked at him. No. Don't lie. Naomi stepped forward, but I raised one hand slightly. I could answer this myself. Grant pointed at me. You built the system. Your company started this. You sit on their committee. And now you stand here pretending you had nothing to do with it? I built North Star, I said. Yes. A few heads turned toward me. I designed part of the evidence architecture. I authorized preservation when Rivergate escalated. Then I disclosed my conflict and removed myself from investigative decisions. Grant laughed bitterly. Convenient. Outside counsel answered from behind Naomi. Ms. Hale's recusal is documented. Investigative scope, financial tracing, witness review, and findings were controlled independently. Grant ignored him. This is revenge, because Dad didn't invest in your little company. For the first time that night, I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because the old email suddenly felt very far away. I never asked this investigation to prove anything about me. You hated us. No, Grant. I stopped needing you. That was all I said. I did not tell the room about the scholarship. I did not mention the procurement job. I did not repeat every joke or every dismissal. None of it was relevant. Grant wanted a sibling fight because a sibling fight could make the evidence look emotional. I would not give him one. Naomi returned to the facts. North Star's technical findings were independently confirmed. The cross-project anomalies were identified through portfolio analysis. The vendor trail was developed through independent audit and legal discovery. Ms. Hale did not control those findings. The reporter near the edge of the group asked, "Is the presidential transition still proceeding?" Everyone looked at Richard. The question was simple, brutal because it was simple. My father looked at Grant. A few minutes earlier, he had introduced him as the future of Hale development. Now the bank had suspended access to the bridge facility. Clients had heard evidence of undisclosed related party transactions. Employees had heard that project records were under review. Richard's voice was low. The transition is suspended, pending review. Grant stared at him. Dad. Richard did not look at him. The announcement is suspended. That was the moment Grant lost the room. Not when my title was revealed. Not when the valuation was mentioned. Not even when the financial trail was presented. He lost it when the father who had protected him his entire life could no longer say, in front of witnesses, that nothing had changed. The applause from less than an hour earlier felt impossible now. My mother sat with both hands around her glass without drinking. Lucas looked exhausted. Grant stood alone despite being surrounded by hundreds of people. And my father looked older than he had when the evening began. I did not feel triumphant. I felt light. For years I had carried the burden of being misunderstood, as if understanding me were something I had failed to earn. That burden disappeared in the ballroom. My family had not lacked evidence of who I was. They had lacked curiosity. And inside Hale Development, that same habit had become more dangerous. Richard believed Grant because Grant was the heir. Lucas protected Grant because family conflict was supposed to stay private. Cynthia protected the image because image was how she understood safety. Grant learned that confidence could survive almost anything if the family kept clearing obstacles from his path. Rivergate had finally created an obstacle they could not move. The report had his name on it. The access log had his account. The delay email had his instruction. The banking trail had his financial interest. The loan package had his approval. No one had humiliated Grant. He had documented himself. I looked around the ballroom. At the clients, the bankers, the employees, the reporters, the people my father had gathered because he believed public confidence would protect the Hale name. The truth had not needed me to shout. It had only needed the records to survive long enough to reach the room. And they had. The morning after the gala, every important person in Charlotte seemed to know a different version of what had happened. Some said the bank had shut Hale Development down in the ballroom. That was not true. Others said Grant had been arrested. That was not true either. The reality was slower, more procedural, and in some ways, more painful. Consequences did not arrive as one dramatic explosion. They arrived as letters, board meetings, legal notices, canceled appointments, revised credit terms, and phone calls that were no longer returned. Hale Development's board called an emergency meeting within 48 hours. Grant was suspended from all operational authority pending completion of the board's own review. His access to company financial systems was restricted. Procurement authority was transferred to an interim committee. Any vendor relationship connected to Blue Ridge Materials was frozen for examination. My father objected. He no longer had enough support to stop it. That was the first consequence Richard seemed unable to understand. For decades, Hale Development had been his company in every practical sense. Even after outside directors and institutional lenders became involved, he still believed his judgment sat above the structure. Now the structure was acting without his permission. The board hired separate counsel. Not Lucas, not the attorneys who had handled the family succession documents, separate counsel. Their findings took months. I did not participate. By then, Sentinel had completed its obligations regarding the relevant evidence, and I had no reason to insert myself into Hale Development's internal decisions. I learned the outcome the same way many people did, through formal notices, legal filings, and limited conversations with my family. The board concluded that Grant had violated his fiduciary duties by failing to disclose his beneficial financial interest in the vendor network connected to Blue Ridge Materials. It also found that he had approved incomplete and misleading credit disclosure materials while the company was seeking the $28 million bridge facility. His termination was for cause. Grant was no longer president, he was no longer an employee, and the succession plan my father had spent years preparing was formally abandoned. The civil consequences took longer. Blue Ridge Materials and related entities were sued over disputed payments, disclosure failures, and damages connected to the vendor arrangements. Some claims were contested. Others moved toward negotiated settlement. Grant faced reimbursement demands and legal expenses that consumed money faster than he had expected. He sold a vacation property first. Then he liquidated most of his investment portfolio. The large house Dad had helped him buy remained for a while, but the lifestyle around it disappeared. Club memberships ended. Trips stopped. Cars were sold. I did not watch this closely. I did not need to. My mother told me more than I wanted to know. "He's losing everything," she said during one phone call. "No," I said. "He's paying obligations." "Maddie, I'm not trying to be cruel. It sounds cruel." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Losing everything would mean having no choice and no responsibility. Grant had choices." She did not answer. The financial investigation continued beyond Hale Development's internal review. I was careful not to speculate about outcomes. Some allegations were broader than what was ultimately established. Some early assumptions did not survive full review. That mattered to me because accountability was not supposed to mean treating every suspicion as proven. Eventually, Grant accepted a negotiated resolution covering specific financial and disclosure violations. He did not go to prison. Some people seemed disappointed by that. I was not. The outcome included substantial financial obligations and restrictions preventing him, for a defined period, from holding senior management positions in businesses financed by the group of institutional lenders connected to the reviewed transactions. For a man who had spent his entire life preparing to become president of Hale Development, that restriction mattered. His punishment was not theatrical, it was structural. The kind of authority he had expected to inherit was no longer available to him. I saw Grant once during that period. It was not planned. We were both at my parents' house because my mother had asked us to come on different days and somehow managed to confuse her own schedule. Grant was in the kitchen when I arrived. He looked thinner, not ruined, not broken, just older. For a moment we stood there without speaking. Then he said, "You got what you wanted." I set my keys on the counter. "No." He laughed once. "You always say that." "Because you keep assuming this was about wanting your life. You think you're better than me. I think you believe Dad would always fix the consequences. His face changed. I had not planned to say it, but once the words were there, neither of us could pretend they were untrue. Grant looked toward the back window. He always did. It was the first honest thing I had heard him say about the entire situation. Not an excuse, not exactly. More like recognition. He had spent his life being protected so consistently that protection had started to feel like a law of nature. When a schedule became impossible, Dad demanded more effort. When a deal became risky, Dad praised confidence. When Lucas raised concerns, they stayed inside the family. When I questioned Grant's numbers, Dad said Grant knew his business. Grant had made his own choices. But those choices had grown inside a system that repeatedly taught him the same lesson. Move forward. Win first. The family will handle the rest. Rivergate was the first time the rest became too large to handle. Lucas faced a different kind of consequence. The investigation found no evidence that he had created the altered inspection record or approved the misleading loan disclosure package. He had not received the financial benefit traced to Grant. He was not charged with those acts. But his conduct still came under professional review. The disciplinary inquiry focused on conflict management, disclosure obligations, and the way he had handled legal work connected to the LLC structure while knowing that related party risks existed. Lucas defended himself by arguing that he had advised Grant to disclose the relationship. The email proved that. The problem was what he did afterward. Nothing. He knew the structure created risk. He knew disclosure had not occurred. He continued helping the family contain disputes without reporting the conflict to the appropriate governance channels. The professional findings were narrower than the accusations people made after the gala. But they were serious enough. Lucas was formally disciplined. He left his old firm. Several major clients moved their work elsewhere. For the first time in his career, being the quiet person in the room did not protect him. He called me months later. "I keep thinking about that email," he said. "Which part?" "The fact that I thought sending it was enough." I waited. "I warned him," Lucas continued. "Then I told myself his decision was his responsibility." "Was it?" "Partly." "And your part?" He was silent. Then he said, "I knew Dad didn't want anything brought to the board." There it was. Not innocence, not equal guilt. Something more uncomfortable. Complicity with boundaries. Lucas had not made Grant's decisions, but he had confused privately objecting with publicly fulfilling his duty. "I thought staying calm made me neutral," he said. "It didn't. I know that now." I believed him. That did not erase anything. But belief and forgiveness were not the same thing, and neither required pretending the past had been different. My father's consequences were perhaps the hardest for him to accept. Richard was not accused of creating the vendor arrangement. He had not signed Grant's delay email. He had not personally altered project documents. But the governance review concluded that his leadership had become a risk to the company. He had ignored warning signs. He had allowed succession planning to influence business judgment. He had resisted lender meetings during a liquidity crisis. He had chosen family containment over independent review too many times. The board removed him from daily operational authority. He remained a significant owner. He retained the title of founder and chairman emeritus. But he no longer ran Hale Development. An independent CEO was hired. Dad hated that more than almost anything. For 40 years, his identity had been tied to making decisions. Now decisions were made in meetings he did not attend. Hale Development itself survived. That mattered to me. The company sold 2 development projects to reduce debt and strengthen liquidity. It renegotiated portions of its lending structure under stricter covenants. Vendor approval procedures were rebuilt. Related party disclosures became mandatory under expanded review. The company became smaller, more cautious, less glamorous, but it remained alive. Hundreds of employees kept their jobs. Subcontractors continued getting paid. Projects that had nothing to do with Grant's misconduct were completed. I was relieved. I had never wanted Hale Development destroyed. That would have punished people who had not made the decisions. Accountability was supposed to separate responsibility, not spread suffering, as widely as possible. Around that time, I received an approach through an investment advisor. A group was considering acquiring a significant Hale development ownership position. They knew about my assets and asked whether I wanted to participate. I said no. The advisor sounded surprised. You would have influence over the restructuring. I don't want it. It could be financially attractive. Maybe. You know the company better than most outside investors. No, I said. I know the family better. That was exactly why I stayed away. Buying Hale Development would have turned every accusation Grant made about revenge into something that looked almost believable. More importantly, I did not want my father's company. I never had. My success was not a route back into the building I had left. It was a life outside it. My mother struggled the longest with the collapse of the old family story. She still spoke in softened language. Grant had made mistakes. Lucas had been too trusting. Dad had been pushed aside. I rarely corrected her, not because I agreed. Because institutional judgments already existed. The board findings existed. The civil claims existed. The disciplinary findings existed. The restructuring terms existed. I no longer needed to argue facts at the dinner table. One afternoon, Dad called me and asked to meet. We sat at a quiet restaurant outside Charlotte, where no one from his old business circle was likely to interrupt him. He looked smaller without the office around him, not physically, contextually. For the first 20 minutes, he talked about Hale Development. The independent CEO was too cautious, the lenders were overreaching, the board had forgotten who built the company. I listened. Finally, he said, "You could have helped." With what? You knew things before I did. I knew there was a protected investigation. You're my daughter. Yes. That should mean something. It does. Then why didn't you call me? I looked at him. Because you had the same opportunity to ask questions everyone else had. His face hardened. I trusted my son. So did I once. He looked away. For the first time, I saw the real injury underneath his anger. Richard had not only lost authority, he had lost certainty. He had built his family around the belief that he could identify strength correctly. Grant was the heir. Lucas was the protector. I was the daughter who chose wrong. Every consequence had challenged that belief. He asked, "Do you think I caused this?" I answered carefully, "No. Grant made his choices. Lucas made his. You made yours." That's not an answer. It's the only fair one. He sat back. I did not forgive him that day. He did not apologize. But for once, neither of us hid behind a simpler story. The family had spent years treating protection as love. Grant learned that consequences could be delayed. Lucas learned that private warnings counted as courage. Richard learned that loyalty meant keeping problems inside the family. My mother learned that appearances could smooth over almost anything. And I learned something too. I had spent years thinking freedom would come when they finally understood who I was. It did not. Freedom came when their understanding stopped controlling what I knew about myself. The Gala exposed the truth publicly. The months afterward did something quieter. They assigned responsibility. Grant lost the authority he had abused. Lucas faced consequences for the silence he had called neutrality. Richard lost operational control of the company he had allowed family loyalty to endanger. Hale Development survived under people who were not required to protect anyone's ego. And I went back to Sentinel. I still had the patents. I still had my executive role. I still had more money than my family had ever imagined. But I did not use any of it to buy their company, control their future, or make them dependent on me. That would have been another version of Richard's world. Power used to decide what everyone else should become. I wanted something different. For the first time, each member of my family had to live with the consequences of their own decisions, including me. And my decision was simple. I was done trying to earn a place inside a legacy that had only ever made room for a smaller version of me. I did not rebuild my life around punishing my family. For a while, people expected me to. After the gala, after the board findings, after Grant lost his position and Dad lost control, there were plenty of opportunities to make the story uglier. Reporters wanted comments, investors wanted my angle. People who had ignored me for years suddenly wanted lunch. I said no to almost all of it. What I wanted was not attention. I wanted usefulness. 6 months after the restructuring, I created the Hale Futures Foundation with an initial $12 million endowment. The foundation funded scholarships for first-generation engineering students, training programs for structural inspection technicians, and safety initiatives for aging public buildings. The name was deliberate. For most of my life, Hale Legacy had meant inheritance, control, and who got to carry my father's company forward. I wanted it to mean something measurable. Each year, the foundation published the Hale Legacy Report. Not a glossy family brochure, a real report. How many students funded? How many technicians trained? How many schools, bridges, warehouses, and public facilities received support for risk assessment? Numbers that helped people, not numbers used to rank children at a dinner table. Grant wrote to me almost a year later. It was a letter, not a text. 3 pages. Careful handwriting. No excuses in the first paragraph, which surprised me. He wrote that I had not destroyed him. He had done that by believing consequences were things other people faced. He said Dad's protection had felt like love for so long that he stopped recognizing it as protection. He said Rivergate was not the first time he chose confidence over honesty, only the first time the record survived long enough to prove it. I read the letter once, then I put it away. I was not ready to answer. Lucas apologized differently, quieter, more direct. He told me he had spent years calling his silence maturity, because that sounded better than fear. He said he warned Grant privately, because private warning let him feel ethical without risking anything. I thought staying calm made me neutral, he said. It made you useful, I told him. He nodded. That was the beginning of something honest, not something close. My mother took longer. Cynthia did not understand at first that her version of me had been part of the damage. She thought she had softened the family's disappointment. She thought phrases like, still finding her place, were gentle. Eventually, during one lunch, she said, I kept explaining you to people before I ever asked you to explain yourself. That was the first thing she said that sounded like understanding. We started meeting once a month. Short lunches, neutral places. No pretending everything was healed. That helped. Because I did not want the old relationship back. The old relationship was where the wound lived. My father was last. One afternoon, a package arrived at my office. No long letter, no dramatic confession, just a flat envelope with my name written in his handwriting. Inside was a printed copy of the email I had sent him years earlier, asking him to consider investing in North Star. The old sentence was still there. Not a real business. Under it, in fresh ink, he had written, This was the most expensive mistake I ever made, but not because of the money. I sat with that page for a long time. For years, I thought I wanted him to regret missing the investment. I thought I wanted him to understand that he could have been part of something huge if he had taken me seriously. But that was not what made me cry. What hurt was realizing he finally understood the real loss. He had missed knowing me. Not the company, me. The daughter who still wanted to show him her work before she learned to stop asking. I kept that page. 3 years after the gala, I stepped away from daily operations at Sentinel. I kept my strategic advisory role and my intellectual property interests through MHC Technologies. But I no longer needed to sit inside every system I had helped build. I moved to Asheville, into a quiet house facing the Blue Ridge Mountains, and opened an independent research lab focused on risk prediction for bridges, schools, and aging public buildings. It was not as loud as Sentinel. I liked that. Hale Development survived too. Smaller, more cautious, professionally managed. It was no longer my father's kingdom or Grant's promised throne. It was a company with controls, obligations, and people who deserved better than family mythology. Sometimes Dad attended foundation scholarship ceremonies. He sat in the back. He did not speak unless asked. The first time I saw him there, I felt something loosen. Not forgiveness exactly, Not closure in the clean way people describe it, just the absence of needing anything from him in that moment. In my desk drawer, I kept two things side by side: the email where my father called North Star not a real business, and the first ugly prototype sensor from Georgia Tech. One showed how he had seen me. The other showed who I had been becoming the entire time. That was enough. People sometimes ask whether the Gala was the moment I became free. It wasn't. The Gala corrected the public story. It proved the facts. It made the truth impossible to deny. But freedom came later. Freedom came when I stopped needing their corrected version of me to replace my own. My family once believed legacy was something handed down by the person with the most power. I learned legacy can be something you build after walking away from the table where no one saved you a real seat. My name is Maddie Hale. I built North Star. I kept the patents. I protected the record. I survived the story my family preferred. And then I built a life that no longer needed to answer it.